So my name is Ryan Turnbull, and the committee has graciously allowed me to share a little bit of my research with you tonight. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Birmingham in the UK, and I'm studying Christian theologies of place, particularly how they interact with kind of the legacy of colonialism. If I could just ask everybody during this first part to just remain muted to cut down on the background, that would be great. Before I begin here, I just wanted to say that Amanda Wallen, who's one of the elders here, created this beautiful talking stick for me. So I'll be holding that throughout this presentation. She created these for a bunch of us for the Indigenous Service of the Word that took place earlier this week to kick off our learning journey. And I believe mine is made out of diamond willow and some hawk feathers that she harvested herself. So I'm very grateful for that. And so I'm kind of holding that to keep myself grounded here as I share with you today. And I wanted to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from Treaty 1 land here in Winnipeg, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, and Dakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We are very, very grateful for their stewardship of this land and their hospitality, which allows us to live, work, create, play, and serve God, the Creator here. And a special welcome to all those of you who are joining us from outside of Treaty 1. Welcome here. So I've entitled this presentation, Anglo Protestant Colonial Ideologies, an Introduction. For those of you who are kind of careful theologians and scholars of Anglicanism, you might note that the period I'm going to be talking about, roughly from the mid 16th century through to the end of the 17th century, one could debate how Protestant the English church is at this point. But I wanted to kind of highlight the kind of English Protestant line of thinking around colonialism to kind of differentiate a little bit from kind of perhaps the more dominant story that we've learned in previous work that's been offered around kind of the legacy of the papal bulls. I think that kind of story is a little bit more well known, and so we're going to drill in a little bit on particularly some Puritan sources today. This presentation is responding to the TRC call to action number 49. We call upon all religious denominations and faith groups who have not already done so to repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. These two concepts, doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, get talked about a lot. And what often gets overlooked in this call to action is that they are representative examples of colonial ideologies. The kind of the operative phrase here is such as. So sometimes we talk about kind of undoing colonial thought within the church as merely addressing these two concepts. But what I want to kind of argue tonight is that these two concepts kind of come to us largely in the 19th century, so in the 1800s, as kind of general categories that cover a whole milieu of colonial concepts and ideologies that were used in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries to justify the dispossession of Indigenous land, the enslavement of Indigenous peoples, and the establishment of European colonies here. So the Anglican Church of Canada is not new to this work of repudiating the doctrine of discovery. In fact, as far back as 2010 at the 39th General Synod, Larry Beardy brought motion AO86, which read as follows: Be it resolved that this General Synod repudiate and renounce The doctrine of discovery is fundamentally opposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ and our understanding of the inherent rights that individuals and peoples have received from God. Requests that every diocesan bishop of the Anglican Church of Canada cause this declaration to be proclaimed in every parish and shared with all the nations and peoples located within their dioceses, and requests the primate to share this declaration with the United Nations. Commit to undertake a review of the Church's policies and programs with a view to exposing the historical reality and impact of the doctrine of discovery and eliminating its presence in its contemporary policies, programs, and structures. Encourage each diocese to reflect upon its own history in light of these actions, and encourage all Anglicans to seek a greater understanding of the Indigenous peoples within Canada and to support those peoples in their ongoing efforts for their inherent sovereignty and fundamental human rights as peoples to be respected. And finally, requests that the General Secretary inform all relevant governmental bodies in Canada of its action, and requests that a similar and equivalent review of historical and contemporary policies that contribute to the continuing colonization of Indigenous peoples, and to write to Queen Elizabeth II, the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, requesting that Her Majesty disavow and repudiate publicly the claimed validity of the Christian doctrine of discovery. Now, you'll notice here that there is no mention of terra nullius, right? So even in this motion, doctrine of discovery is once again kind of rhetorically being used as a kind of a catch-all concept for kind of all of the different things that we want to talk about when kind of unpicking the net that colonialism has woven. But it calls us to kind of specifically look into kind of individual kind of policies in our parishes, in our diocesan structures, all of these kinds of things. And so this kind of invites us into a deeper look at some of the kind of the underlying concepts that are kind of covered by this blanket term. So even though good work has started on this, I continue to be troubled by a challenge that two scholars named Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang have offered in their very influential essay, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. Tuck and Yang have pointed out quite simply that decolonization is not just another buzzword to add to our social justice itineraries or equality, diversity, and inclusion agendas. Some universities have even gone so far to change EDI to EDID, equality, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. And this is something that may be helpful in the long run, but Tuck and Yang are suspicious that it is merely kind of just another bit of vocabulary that gets thrown around instead of that just kind of trains us into kind of a polite acceptability that kind of maintains the status quo. Because for Tuck and Yang, what decolonization ultimately means is land back. And so they're worried that we kind of too quickly repudiate the doctrine of discovery or slap decolonization onto some new program as just a way for us settlers to kind of move to innocence and to kind of feel good. Oh, we did our part and now we can quit feeling guilty. They want to challenge us to actually make concrete moves to free up land, treasure, and space for Indigenous self-determination. And if you want, we were talking just before the lecture here about Murray and I recently recorded a podcast. You can find that on From the Narthex, kind of talking about some of the moves institutionally that the church has done to kind of create space for the Indigenous Anglican Church to have some of that space, but there's still work to be done there as well. So with that in mind, let's drill in a little bit on kind of the sources of the kind of concepts, doctrine of discovery, and terra nullius, and see if we can't get a little bit more concrete. So just as a quick review, the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, they come to us, the usual story is that they come to us via several sources. So where these things really first pop up in kind of the usage that we use them today are both in the 19th century, actually. with the McIntosh decision by the Supreme Court of the United States. This was part of a series of legal battles with the Cherokee Nation, having to do with their displacement and the whole Trail of Tears situation. The American courts invoked what they said was the discovery doctrine, which was a principle in the law of the nations, or res gentium, lex gentium, that had been kind of around since the 15th century, and they kind of cited some papal bulls. And so if you want, the papal bulls in question are things like Inter Caetera, Pax Romana, Pax Romanum, and several others, kind of from the 1440s to the 1490s. But another important document in there is something called the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was a treaty between Spain and Portugal in 1494 that essentially drew a line down the globe and said everything to the west of here would be Spain's, and everything to the east of there would be Portugal's. And so if you've ever wondered why in Latin America, Brazil is Portuguese and everything else is Spanish, it's because of the line of this treaty that kind of went down the whole globe and divided the world between these two powers. This was very influential for Catholic powers and for keeping the peace between Spain and Portugal, and was kind of part of the doctrine of discovery, but largely the English ignored it. We'll note in a further slide kind of some ways that they paid attention to it, but for the most part, they didn't care. By the time English colonialism got off the ground, they didn't care what the Pope had to say, and they really weren't that interested in caring about treaties between Catholic powers. So they actually end up making different kinds of appeals, not appeals to the doctrine of discovery so much, even in this kind of early form of it. And so kind of the question that we're looking to answer is what happened during that period. And terra nullius is a 19th century legal concept, which is loosely descended from principles of Roman law, such as res nullius, which means nobody's thing, and terra incognita, which you see on early modern maps and ancient maps, which basically just means lands unknown. And these concepts eventually, actually in the Australian context, is really where you start seeing terra nullius applied as a kind of a legal principle, drawing on some of these kind of previous ideologies of, oh, there's nobody there. And in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the kind of the Australian government starts to use this very explicitly to justify the colony there. So, utopia. Yes. All right. So what I want to introduce us to is two kind of concepts that I think are quite constitutive that go into kind of our understanding now of the doctrine of discovery. And these two concepts are utopia and wilderness. So utopia is a concept that emerges with the work of Thomas More. He wrote a book called Utopia, and it's a satire. It's a political satire filled with all sorts of ironic depictions of this ideal island that is supposed to just be kind of perfect and great. But there's all sorts of things that are, if you kind of read carefully, aren't quite right. And he's playing with this tension, this kind of oral tension between utopia. So for you Greek scholars out there, utopia is like not a place, and utopia, EU, that's the good place. So simultaneously you get this kind of idea of the good place, which actually, wink wink nudge nudge, doesn't exist, right? So he's describing this kind of this idea. Now, you might have remembered watching this animated movie a few years ago, The Road to El Dorado. You've probably heard of El Dorado, this famous city made of gold. Well, that was kind of a city that Spanish explorers were looking for in this kind of utopian quest for like a place that didn't actually exist, right? But actually there was another one of these in North America called Norumbega. You can kind of see here on the map this place, Norumbega. So you got New France up here. And this is kind of like the United States coast here. You got like kind of Atlantic Canada. This is a very bad map, obviously. And down here towards Florida. Norumbega was a mythical city that people allegedly found. And the reason why so many people wanted it to be true was because in the kind of the utopian imaginary of the 16th century in particular, there was this other notion called harmonia mundi. And it was this idea going all the way back to the mapmaker Ptolemy, who's an ancient mapmaker. This idea that there was a basic harmony in the whole world. So if there were things in the old world, such as the city of Venice and the city of Nuremberg and these other places, then you should find, at least in a kind of embryonic form, these things in the new world. And so they'd found what is now Mexico City, and it was full of canals and stuff, and it was kind of built on a lake. And so they thought, oh, that's just like Venice. And so if we go north of there, we should be able to find something like Nuremberg, like this important German imperial city at the time. And so everybody was looking for Norumbega, or there's kind of different spellings of it at the time, but it was supposed to be full of gold, and it was this kind of place. So all through the late 1500s, you see particularly English explorers looking for it, and they're given charters by kings and queens of England to go and lay claim to Norumbega. And this is going to end up being kind of the area where the 13 colonies are. But it's a place that doesn't exist. And so one of the things that motivates people to come is this idea of kind of this utopian idea that based on kind of half believed or half true reports from the New World getting processed through these kind of out of control imaginations by the settlers. This is what kind of brought people there. And I wanted to just comment on mapping as a colonial technology. I said that this wasn't a very good map, but in a certain way, it was a very good map, because you'll remember I mentioned the Treaty of Tordesillas earlier as being this line down the continent. Now, the English didn't really care about Spanish claims. If the Spanish weren't going to actually be there and be able to defend that land, who cared if they were claiming it? But when they were making maps, they wanted to kind of stretch out the coast of the United States to be more east-west, to kind of show that whatever they were finding, whatever they were claiming, was going to be on the Portuguese side, on the east side of that line, because of course the Spanish were down in Florida. So if the Spanish got wind that there was something valuable up the coast, they could just jump in their boats and go and take it. But the Portuguese were nowhere nearby. So the English would purposely kind of skew their maps to kind of make everything look like it was more on this east-west axis rather than a north-south one, in order to kind of like paint the picture that what they were claiming was actually outside of the Spanish territories. So it's just kind of a funny way that the maps of this period are kind of full of all sorts of weird little propaganda. The second bit about utopia, and this is the more kind of nefarious part of utopia, is that one of the key parts to the establishment of a utopia is a kind of original act of circumscription. You read this in More's Utopia itself, and I'll just read this quote quickly for you about the founding of Utopia. But they report, and there remains good marks of it to make it credible, that this was no island at first, but a part of the continent. Utopus, that conquered it, whose name it still carries, for Abraxa was its first name, brought the rude and uncivilized inhabitants into such a good government, and to that measure of politeness, that they now far excel all the rest of mankind. Having soon subdued them, he designed to separate them from the continent, and to bring the sea quite round them. To accomplish this, he ordered a deep channel to be dug, 15 miles long, and that the natives might not think he treated them like slaves, he not only forced the inhabitants, but also his own soldiers, to labor in carrying it on. and he set a vast number of men to work. He, beyond all men's expectations, brought it to a speedy conclusion. And his neighbors, who at first laughed at the folly of the undertaking, no sooner saw it brought to perfection than they were struck with admiration and terror. So utopia itself, this imaginary place in More's satire, was not always an island. It became an island by an act of conquest. Utopus came, brought his army there, and this peninsula was called Abraxa. And then he enslaved everybody, mixed them in with his people, so assimilated everybody together, and then made this original act of circumscription by digging the channel to create an island, and then was able to kind of set up a highly ordered, highly structured, ideal society and establish such a good government that the whole world marveled at. Now, if this is starting to sound familiar to you, then you're absolutely right. This is written in 1516, and by the end of the century, you start seeing European colonists use this idea kind of unironically. They're using it almost as a blueprint for their own colonial endeavors. You see this in the Virginia Company Charter of 1606. We greatly commending and graciously accepting of their desires to the furtherance of so noble a work, which may, by the providence of Almighty God, hereafter tend to the glory of his divine majesty and propagating of Christian religion to such people as yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God, and may in time bring the infidels and salvages living in those parts to humane civility and to a settled and quiet government. Do by these our letters, blah, blah, blah. The Virginia Company was set up, and part of their mandate was to kind of missionize indigenous people and to bring them out of their darkened and ill-informed ways into kind of such a good civility, or civilitas, like a good government. So you see this kind of utopian gesture there in the kind of commercial missionizing impulse of the British Crown. This is going to continue in some kind of peculiar ways in the time of the Puritans. So you may have heard about the Puritans before. They were kind of a group who came to America in around the year 1630. And I want to focus on three Johns: John Cotton, John Winthrop, and John Mason. So they're going to kind of take this utopian impulse and they're going to kind of inflect it through the scriptures, and then contrast another important secondary concept, wilderness, as the justification for taking the land. So first, John Winthrop, his argument for taking possession of the land is it's not strictly a kind of a terra nullius argument, because he acknowledged that there were indeed people there, but he kind of started to make a different kind of argument, saying, well, yes, there are people there, and they're using some of the land, but surely they're not using all of the land. There is what was known in English law at the time, this idea of wasteland. So if you were a landowner and you had, your 100 acres or whatever, 80 of it was in cultivation, but you had that little bit of scrub over there that you didn't really do anything with. Well, anybody was allowed to come and set up a livelihood on that wasteland and kind of like eke out a living if they wanted, because that was kind of up for grabs, even though you owned it. And so the kind of argument that Winthrop presents is that we can go in and we can kind of like look around and see, okay, what parts are they using? What parts are they not? And we'll settle in the wasteland. And then we will turn that into kind of like a new garden, a new Eden. And, we'll kind of rescue it from its savagery and its unuse. So that was kind of the original argument that Winthrop brought. John Cotton he makes a very similar argument. So he was a preacher. So Winthrop was kind of a lawyer and a leader. Cotton was a preacher. And just as they were about to sail off to the so-called New World, John Cotton shows up and he preaches this sermon entitled God's Promise to His Plantation. And he bases it off of 2 Samuel chapter 7. Verse 10, moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own and move no more. So the Puritans saw themselves as Israel, and they saw themselves as fleeing a corrupt Europe that had fallen so far from the true Christian religion, and they were going to go and set up a new pure garden, a plantation. And Cotton said, well, God makes room for people in three ways. First, when he casts out the enemies of a people before them, by lawful war with the inhabitants. And he cites Psalm 44 to do that. And he said, thou didst drive out the heathen before them. And secondly, when he gives foreign people favor in the eye of any native people to come and sit down with them, either by way of purchase, as Abraham did, or else when, as Pharaoh gave the land of Goshen to Jacob. And thirdly, when he makes the country, though not altogether void of inhabitants, yet void in that place where they reside. Where there is a vacant place, there is liberty for the sons of Adam or Noah to come and inhabit. So he's making a threefold argument. One, you could come in by conquest. So this is not by right of discovery. This is by right of conquest. Second, you can be invited in, so by treaty, so kind of by cession. Or he does kind of make a kind of a terra nullius type argument, but inflected through this wasteland idea that there will be these spaces that aren't being used, and that's the places that you can settle down because they're void. And he said, it is a principle in nature that in vacant soil, he that taketh possession of it and bestoweth culture and husbandry upon it, and improve land that is lying waste, get kind of a new right to it. This idea of improving land to lay claim to it is often attributed to John Locke, but he doesn't really write until the end of the 17th century. And so it's kind of curious to me that you see this already in the arguments that the Puritans are making in the 1630s. I'm just going to skip over this. I wanted to point out that this notion around wilderness and the Wilderness Act is in 1964, the US government passed an act defining wilderness as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. Essentially saying that wilderness is empty of human life. So again, this kind of wasteland idea, right? And we need to keep people out of it. But as we all know, indigenous uses of the land were not the same way that settled peoples use the land, right? And so what looked and counted as use to settlers ends up really erasing the way indigenous people occupied the land, and in fact shaped a lot of the kind of the wilderness landscapes that were either admired or feared. Yes, and all right, we will go on here to the Puritans and plantations. I've spoken a little bit about this already, but just to kind of summarize, the Exodus motif is kind of everywhere in these early Puritan sources. The Puritans definitely saw themselves as kind of a new Exodus. So they identified very strongly with the Israelites. William Bradford talks about this. In John Mason's history of the wars with the Pequot people, so he was the military captain who waged war against the Pequot, he kind of explicitly, by citation of scripture and by kind of constant referral to God's providence, he kind of makes it very clear that actually all the kind of atrocities that his men committed weren't actually committed by his men. They were committed by God, a kind of a sovereign God, displacing this wicked people and establishing a place for the Puritans. Um, so for Mason and for a lot of these other writers, there is kind of a pushing back by God of wilderness and the wild men in it in order to kind of establish a garden, a seed bed. Even the idea of a seminary, the seminaries of Harvard and Yale that were later planted, is this idea of a seed bed where you plant new seeds that will then grow kind of a new Eden, a new Christian Eden. I think it was John Winthrop who kind of coined the idea of America being a city on a hill, which of course Ronald Reagan so recently took up again in his fight against the Soviet Union, right? You've all remembered the idea of the city on the hill, but this comes again from the Puritans, and this idea that what they were planting was kind of a new plantation, a garden, something bounded, importantly, by a hedge. And this act of utopian kind of circumscription here is really important because outside of the hedge is wilderness, wild men, wild howling, but inside is such a good government. And when they would evangelize, they would report on the success that they were having with their new converts. But then over time, they started to record, and you see this in Cotton Mather's writing a lot, another influential Puritan who wrote a history of the Americas. He starts to report of rot among the converts, and he starts getting very anxious about holes in the hedge and that things are creeping in amongst them. Things from the outside, from the wilderness, were getting in. And eventually he would actually be one of the men who oversaw the Salem witch trials. And we won't talk too much about those tonight, but it is important, I think, to note that the witch trials first lashed out against an Indigenous woman who probably had some Afro-Caribbean background. And part of the reason that she was identified as a witch was because for the past 100 years, reports from the New World of how Indigenous people practice their religious ceremonies were making their way back and entering into the manuals by which witch hunters would identify what a witch is. So when witch hunters came to the New World, they were primed to look for particularly Indigenous practices. And so this utopian experiment that tried to build a kind of a perfect garden in a nice bounded hedge, it ended up collapsing into like paranoia and violence. That ultimately kind of destroyed some of these communities, but also kind of wreaked havoc on Indigenous peoples. So I've run over the time that I set for myself. So I just wanted to conclude with this quote from Alex Zukis. He says that in most past mystifications, those involved were to a certain extent aware of the deception. An ideology which is a mystification is never completely ignorant of the fact. I think what we see in the period, particularly of the Puritans, and this kind of period that we've kind of been taught to think of as just representing the ideology of doctrine of discovery, is a whole bunch of different attempts to justify what was going on. And each of them don't really make sense on their own. And when they quit making sense, sometimes a new kind of contradictory argument would be thrown at the wall, or a new supplementary one would be thrown. And eventually these things are all kind of masked over by just kind of replacing that with these clean concepts of doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. But the reality of this period is that it's just a lot of mystification and a lot of kind of whatever worked, kind of pragmatic types of arguments that would appease whoever kind of had the power to make your life miserable in order to kind of justify the colonial endeavor. And so I think we should continue to study this period as one that's has a lot of kind of moving parts to it, and that as we continue to kind of repudiate the doctrine of discovery, we should be mindful of all the kind of complexities there. So I've put a couple of discussion questions here. I think we're going to go into breakout rooms now, and Elizabeth has them on a separate slide that she'll send out to the discussion groups. So we'll take about 15 minutes in those breakout rooms, and then we'll come back, and I would love to hear kind of anything you heard, any questions that you had, and we can kind of wrap up that way. Well, thanks for sticking with the breakout time. I think what would be really great for me is if each group could kind of, I don't know if you can appoint somebody from each group to maybe just share a little bit with the group what you talked about, so that we can kind of hear how this was heard, and if there were any kind of unresolved questions or anything from your discussion groups, I'd be happy to field those, but I'd love to hear back from you all. Why don't we just go in order then? Start with group one. And
because I missed part of it, because I'm waiting for CAA to come, and I could pop up and leave any moment, which is why I was late getting in here. So maybe Landon, could you speak on what we had the discussion on?
Sure, I could, and then yeah, anybody's welcome to fill in what I might miss.
Right, thank you.
So we ended up addressing a lot about different sort of approaches to land use, and how showing up to this new land, they would have had very different sort of sense of what counts for what you can occupy, and spent a fair amount of time talking about scripture as well, and how having a sort of sense of a higher call of authority might get people to do things that they may not have justified on their own before. So once you have a sense that God's calling you to do a certain thing, there's just sort of a new sort of warrant and license to do things that would have been harder to justify, perhaps, without a sort of scriptural sense of defense for it. That's a very brief overview of what we discussed. I'm not sure, Karen, if you had a particular thing you wanted to add.
I didn't hear everything that you said, but yeah, I think we just talked a little bit about the expansiveness and how that the settlers might have thought it was limitless and empty because the people who lived there weren't always in the same spot all the time, especially if they were nomadic. They were hunting and trapping and fishing and whatnot. They'd be moving around, and that coming from, say, England with its nice orderly little walled areas, they would have maybe thought that this went on forever and they could do whatever they liked with it.
One of the things that's really striking about some of the reports, so I'm thinking particularly of John Mason's history of the Pequot Wars, is that, you know, we like to think, oh, they were all kind of like nomadic and using the land in these kind of different kind of ways. But he explicitly says, we saw their corn because it was the season of harvest and they had an abundant harvest. And so after we dealt with them, or actually God had dealt with them, we loaded up all their corn and we took it home with us. So they knew full well that, like, that was a kind of a really glaring admission. They knew full well that they were cultivating the land, using like quite good farmers, that kind of stuff, and actually that they kind of plundered all of that stuff. And then kind of to go on a little bit later and see kind of defenses in the vein of, oh, they weren't using it properly. It's like, well, what more could they possibly have been doing than growing excellent corn, you know? So yeah.
Depends where they landed though, right? I mean, if you land in the middle of Northern Ontario, you're going to get a different impression than if you land in Massachusetts, say, right?
Yes.
Different uses because there's different people living there. They're not all the same kind of people.
Yeah, yeah. But I just mean, you see these kinds of like bizarre kind of, like these are all appearing from the Puritans in that part of the world, right? These kind of contradictory remarks. And so they're dealing with a similar geography and yet making kind of just like these kind of wildly contradictory statements. So group two.
I'm going to ask Vincent to take this because he was a little bit more with it than I was. But the one thing I did see out of this, I think it was towards, what the scriptures were doing or whatever. And I had explained that my background was because being Métis, we really got into the church because that was the only thing we had. We had lost everything. We had lost our families and whatnot. So we had to forge a new life. So, but Vincent and I were talking about the going to hell and whatnot like that. But if he could talk a little bit about that, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. Ava says that I was more with it. It just means that I spoke more than she did this time. Sorry, Ava.
How did you manage that?
I know, eh?
He actually got a word in twice. He remembered my name. What can I say?
Yeah, that's true. I did, didn't I? Well, what we talked about mostly was this whole idea of colonization coming not with Christianity, not just as a support with the imperial powers, which is what it was, right?
Yeah.
But it also came with their own, these Christians and Christian churches came with their own agendas as well. And part of that was the harvesting of souls, as some scholars have said. It really wasn't for them mostly about expanding territorial boundaries, but it was also about making sure that the heathens were saved. And I think part of what was going on at that time as well was this whole teaching that came out of perhaps the time of the Dark Ages. I forget what that one is called. Where heaven and hell were predominant doctrines, right? And that the gospel of Christ with the missionaries came with the whole idea of hell, and how that was used by these early missionaries to often put fear into people, and to use that idea of hell to control and manipulate the indigenous peoples, at least here in Canada, or maybe all across the Americas anyway, likely all over the land. And so I think that way they used and rewrote scripture sometimes, perhaps, or rewrote thoughts that were maybe not necessarily what Christ had intended when he sent off his disciples out into the world to preach the gospel and the good news. But the other thing that Angela brought up was this whole idea of the Catholic ladder and the Protestant ladder, right? One, if you were climbing the Protestant or the Catholic and the Protestant ladder, you were climbing into a place of enlightenment and heaven, and therefore were going the right way. But if you were taking the indigenous ladder with indigenous spirituality, that led to hell, and so you were doomed if you did that kind of thing, which of course also promoted fear in people, and because of that, there was susceptibility to being controlled and manipulated by the churches, and unfortunately, the gospel came with other things besides what I think was intended to be. Did I forget something?
No, I think that was pretty good. Pretty close to what we were talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Vince. That I believe that ladder, I've seen pictures of it. It's quite scary. It was largely used as a missionary tool in the 19th century more. In the 16th and 17th centuries, or in the 16th century in particular, you get these reports of so there's kind of a debate through the 16th century whether or not Indigenous people are descendant of Adam. Because if they're descendant of Adam, then they have rights to property in the same way that all descendants of Adam have. If they're not descendants of Adam, then they don't. And so this gets settled in by the time of the Puritans by saying, no, they are descendants of Adam, but you still see claims being made to try and suggest that they're the children of Satan. And in particular, one really bad image that gets used is they say, well, see how they dance around the fire there? Well, that's because it reminds them of their home, their father's home, where they can dance in the flames of hell. And this kind of example was to kind of demonize again, and again to kind of undermine those what's really going on there. Not even just saying to demonize people, but to kind of undermine their property rights, right? Because if you can say that they're not descended from Adam, then by what right do they have any property? And so it's a pretty nefarious thing that that gets going. And I think, yeah, that 19th century ladder is. Do you remember what it's called? They talk about it in the TRC reports, but you can find Google images of this thing, and it's quite bad.
And I was also saying in our group, and I point this out to people there in Winnipeg, I have Ted Fontaine's book, Rest in Peace. I know he just passed recently, but I was saying that because I had originally been introduced to that many years ago from a Jesuit priest who told me about the Catholic ladder, which at first I'd never heard anything about. Anyway, I saw in Ted Fontaine's book when he's talking about his experiences and in residential school, he makes a slight mention to it. He doesn't talk about it as the Catholic ladder, but more about some of the teaching that he was given there. And it struck me right away that that's what it was. It was the Catholic ladder or the Protestant ladder that he was, as a youth, as a young person had been exposed to. So, the evidence is there locally.
There was also this time as well where I'm not quite sure which, I forget which date it would have been, about 16th century, perhaps 17th century, where there was this debate in Spain with Bishop de Casa, perhaps, and someone else, where they talked about whether or not Indigenous people were actually human.
Victoria,
non-European people, right?
Yeah,
were actually human, and if that were if the case was that no, they weren't, then you can enslave them and take whatever it is that they have as your own kind of thing, and that was, if that was something that was being talked about even back then it must have been something that was already being understood, that Indigenous people were not human and that you can actually do all of these things to them, take their land and everything else, right? Because they were less than, and we were higher up within the enlightened human scale, right? And so, but the fact that the church actually had to step in and decide what would happen, I found that quite amazing.
Yeah, I've put the name of that text. It's called De Indis by Francisco de Vitoria. and he was at the University of Salamanca. He's considered, there's actually a statue of him in the United Nations because he's considered the founder of modern human rights theory. Because he argued quite successfully in defense of the what in his language the Amerindians, that they indeed were, had property rights, were descended of Adam, all of these different kinds of things, kind of put to rest all the Spanish arguments. And so that happens in like the 1530s, which is why I think it's important for the Anglican Church to look at the Puritan period in the 1630s, because the Puritans have to make a whole new set of justifications, because the ones that the Spanish used in Latin America have kind of been shown to be false, right? So if the English are going to come and do their bit, they're going to have to come up with some new ideas for how they're going to justify it. They don't get to use the kinds of arguments that were used by the kind of the first wave of Spanish conquistadors, which is why I think it's useful to kind of look at the way that the kind of the Anglican version of the quote unquote doctrine of discovery relies much more on these kind of scriptural types of arguments. And we don't get to just blame the Pope, I suppose, is what I'd want to say. We have our own skeletons in the closet.
Yeah, one of the things that we were wanting to ask is if you had any examples of what kind of scripture they would have used, but I mean, we can get there once we hear from the other people.
So some of the things we were discussing were similar to the other groups, but talking about people who came from persecution and then came into Canada and became the persecutors, possibly unintentionally, unaware of what was happening, talking about the Mennonites coming in and being given large tracts of land to interrupt treaty negotiation and that type of thing. So Margaret, you want to jump off from there?
Well, a lot of what I brought to it anyway was how the Christians and like the Pilgrims and that took parts of the Bible to allow them to do things they wanted to do. And it's like, and it seems like the English disregarded everybody, whatever, it didn't matter what anybody else was doing, what they were doing was right.
Yeah, I think that kind of covers what we talked about. Vincent, in response to kind of some of the scriptures that were used, so you would think that Joshua, the book of Joshua, would be a really obvious place to go, and I was surprised at how they don't really cite the book of Joshua. There seems to be a kind of a background in some, so in particular, like John Mason's brief history of the Pequot Wars, it seems like narratively he's structuring it on the, like, kind of, he's making a lot of allusions to the book of Joshua, but he doesn't actually cite Joshua. He cites things like Psalm 44. We have heard with our ears, O God, our fathers have told us what work thou did in their days, in the times of old, how thou did drive out the heathen with thine hand and planted them, how thou did afflict the people and cast them out. For they got not the land in possession by their sword, neither did their own arm give them, but thy right hand and thine arm and the light of thy countenance, because thou had a favor unto them. And so he takes this psalm and he puts it right on the title page. And then all throughout his little history, he says, he keeps kind of referring back to it and saying, God established this. You know, when they burn down barns or whatever, it's like God's judgment, God's right hand did this, right? The finger of the Lord drove them out. And he's constantly kind of making these kinds of references. And there's a lot of kind of in the sermon to God's promise to his plantation, I believe it's on second Samuel chapter 7, and kind of I mentioned that near the end where he kind of talks about kind of using these different justifications based on that, but he's building it all out of 2 Samuel. So what I think is kind of characteristic of the way that they appeal. Oh, the slide. There was one slide here near the end. Michael Wigglesworth, a waste and howling wilderness where none inhabited, but hellish fiends and brutish men that devils worshipped. This is a direct reference to Deuteronomy 32, verse 10. So he's describing the new world and the how wild it is and how full of kind of wild Satan worshiping men it is. But he's doing that by way of an allusion to Deuteronomy 32. And so all of this stuff kind of really adds up to, and I talked about this in our small group, a kind of a supersessionism, which is a kind of a technical word for when the church views itself in the place of Israel.
Yes,
And
yes.
this, I think, is the major rhetorical move that happens over and over and over again in the work of the Puritans, is to position themselves as God's chosen people, as the Israelites, and so that they're kind of guided by God into this new promised land to set up a new Eden, a new Jerusalem, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well,
So
that's
Ryan, are there any New Testament scriptures that were used? It seems like it's very Old Testament.
I will say yes. I am not I don't have comprehensive knowledge of the Puritans.
Okay.
You might want to check the work of Mark Stoll, would be a great source for you on this, or Evan Barry, have both written quite extensively on kind of this topic among the Puritans, and they would be much better guides to this. Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
It's interesting. I've always kind of thought that, and people that I get people kind of upset with me whenever I say this, but I think that within the church, the non-indigenous church, let's put it that way, the non-indigenous people have now become these new heathens, right? And that the white church is the new Israel. And so I think that sometimes even that whole idea of that what the Americans basically thought of, or even other people, that they were now the new chosen people, is still very much in existence. I think it's just been modified a little bit to exclude others. And a lot of that exclusion you can see through the rejection of indigenous people, and by letting the other outside, or keeping them outside because they don't belong, or they're still different, right?
Parker has shared in the chat that Luke 14:23 was a favorite, to compel them to come in.
Before I get really underway, I think I was just very fascinated by the ladder analogy that we surfaced. Very interesting to think about that. When you're going on a ladder, you're going upwards. So the idea of going upwards to hell doesn't make any sense on a ladder. If you're going anywhere, you're going up, not down, unless you're at the top and descending or somehow, or being pushed off of it. Be interesting to know more about what that kind of ladder, delving more into that. However, I think our group sort of was waiting for a little bit before people came into conversation. But I think I'd like to ask Krista to tell us a little more about the Protestant sort of angle, because we ran out of time, but we wanted to explore that a little more. And I think there's something to be said there. And we did talk a little bit about some of the Spanish influences as well. But maybe Krista or even Marlene could say a bit more about that.
I guess really the only question we actually looked at was the first one, just in terms of how your information has maybe expanded or reframed our understanding. And I think that, when we hear about the doctrine of discovery and terra nullis, as Protestants, we kind of can almost feel like we've gotten out because we aren't Roman Catholic, and that was somehow wasn't quite us. And so what you've done tonight, Ryan, I think is extremely important in showing us that we came up with our own rationales. And we didn't need to have a papal bull necessarily, or I mean, even if others had put to rest the idea that indigenous peoples were not non-humans, that they were in fact sons of Adam or descendants of Adam, and therefore entitled to property rights. So apparently that's already figured out at this point. But Protestants still had other ways of basically taking advantage of the situation and going along with the colonial process. So I think that in the past, the doctrine of discovery discussion, like you said, it was quite narrow. It kind of focused in on this one thing, and what you've done is kind of broadened it for us. In the expansion, seeing more of our place in it. And just the last little bit that Vince was saying, in terms of how do we still see it today, and talking about how, in a lot of places, the white church still kind of sees itself as the chosen, identifies with Israel, and that anything that isn't like that is heathen. So this idea of assimilation is still often very much the preferred or dominant theme. So we might, I think in some ways there's almost a view of, well, we're not quite there, but we do sort of view things that are different, not in a way of so much celebrating the variety and the complexity of God's creation, but almost as entertainment. We see it more maybe in an entertaining way, like, oh, we can try new foods, we can go travel and see different places, and then we can come home and live our lives. But it's kind of, so there's different things there that I think still exist today, for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Krista. When you read through, now the TRC reports are very valuable to read through. But one of the things that started to kind of frustrate me about the historical volumes is the way it would kind of just jump from, papal bull all the way to the Supreme Court decision, right? So like from 1492 to like 1800 whatever that decision was. And I was like, well, what happened in between? Like there's several hundred years here, and sometimes people will mention John Locke. But I kind of was asking myself this question of like, there had to be more things going on than just John Locke writing a couple books. And so that was kind of what inspired me to kind of, dig into this a little bit more and to kind of ask, like, have we Anglicans really dealt with our legacy? Or have we just kind of, apologized for something the Roman Catholics did and then patted ourselves on the back afterwards? So.
Well, how involved was the Anglican Church?
Quite.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, so Puritans were Anglicans.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. Many of them were. And there's the Anglican Church has its own kind of history of involvement in colonialism, but that would be for another presentation, I think. But this, I picked this period because it's kind of the start of their kind of activities in North America.
No, it's
And apparently there was a real talk about, narrow vision, like if you wanted your son to be a leader, you had to name them John.
Yeah. 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 There were a lot of Johns, that's for sure.
It's interesting too, because most recently the Lutheran Church, Lutherans, evangelical Lutherans in Canada, certainly their pastors are saying, well, in what ways can we come on board as a church that did not run these residential schools, and who have many come from a history themselves of oppression and escaping difficult situations. In what way can they be part of this ongoing sort of movement to move away from this doctrine and help us to come to a reconciliation together? And their conclusion, at least at the moment, at least some of the pastors in the city here, are to perhaps be in relationship with the survivors themselves, as opposed to any church or whatever, but rather to make direct contact.
Yeah.
But I don't. It's not just the residential schools. To me, that's just one horrible thing in this whole horrible thing. The fact that the Lutherans may not have been part of the residential schools, they didn't run them, but I look back on this and I remember he wasn't here, his family, his ancestors weren't here. Why is he having to apologize and be part of it? Well, you live on this land, you get hydro from the dams up north, which were created by affecting Indigenous lives. You drink the water. To me, it's got nothing, it doesn't matter whether your particular religious group or your faction or your group of people, whatever, were involved in all of the atrocities. You're still benefiting from what was done by the fact that you live here. You're drinking the water, you're using electricity, you're living on the land, all of that stuff. And that's all because of colonization 500, 600 years ago, and the attitude towards the Indigenous people at that time. So to me, anybody here now should still be like, that's, to me, this is what the land acknowledgement is, a very small little way of saying we're sorry. It's a small little step. At least that's the way I feel.
Those land acknowledgements and the things that we're waking up to should point us to the realities of the doctrine itself. But past that, to what Ryan has opened up to us, that it wasn't just Roman Catholic papal bulls and things of that nature, that the Protestant backgrounds from which we come also play a role, and colonization was not limited, as you mentioned, Elizabeth, just to residential schools. It is the idea of coming in with this conquering mentality that we have the right to this empty lands, even when we began as a church from England into the shores of Canada to create this great nation that we have. I mean, it comes from that source where the crown is sending people to colonize and to make this land their own for the crown.
And to me, I mean, even the newcomers now, what a wonderful thing to have them now acknowledge when they take the oath to become citizens. They acknowledge that they are going to abide by the treaty, which was one of the calls to action. And at better late than never, but to me, I mean, this is the whole, like, people who come to Canada even now still have to thank the Indigenous people, but they also still have to remember that they're building their lives here based on what the English and French and everybody else, the non-Indigenous people, did hundreds of years ago. And remember that. And it's not a matter of, it wasn't my ancestors that did it. It's, well, you're living here and you've got a good life here because of what was done in the past. So remember that. That's the way I feel. It goes deeper than just apologizing. Like what Ryan said about decolonization. Is that what you said? That, oh, if we say that now, we can say we're sorry and now it doesn't matter anymore. We're innocent again. Well, we're not innocent because we're still here. And I have to stop talking.
I think there was a valid point that Ryan made early on too. There's a slide that you had there, Ryan, where that, I wish I could see it in front of me now, where you reference the fact that even those who believed they were justified in their actions had a sense of this not being 100% right, but yet they carried on. That's a really, really bad paraphrase. I hope you have a sense of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, the quote, I think, was, in most past mystifications, those involved were to a certain extent aware of the deception. An ideology which is a mystification is never completely ignorant of the fact.
Yeah, and you hear often the justification, well, that, and you heard that from the Archbishop recently with the discovery of the 215 interned bodies, that, well, it was tuberculosis and they died and this was how it was back then. And that almost an innocence in history.
You know,
and there was some, oh, sorry, Sylvia, go ahead.
Can I say something? You know, listening to everybody, as an Indigenous person, I'm really, really thankful for the background that I had. My ancestors who believed so much in the beauty of the earth, in taking care of the earth. You know, it's very muddling listening to all this history about the Bible. I like the Bible, but I do not read certain parts of it because I find it very violent. I find it very, very violent. I only read the good parts of it. The things I go into is Solomon, the Psalms. You know, when I need comfort, that's where I go. When I need to find strength, I go. That's where I go. And I'm very, very thankful. Grandmother, when she was alive, she said, before churches came into our lives, we already had our own beliefs. You know, and she said, when the churches came, the missionaries came, we took it because there was some good stuff in there. And we already believed in a lot of what's going on. And then what she said was, we believed you could pray anywhere. You can pray where there's trees. You don't have to have a church. And when men went out to kill for food, they prayed for what they had. You know, and listening to this, it's really confusing to me because our lives were very simple. By the way, my family believed. They believed in Kisemantu. They believed in the church, but they had their lives, and they respected nature. They respected people. Now that's lost. That's lost from the way I was when I was growing up. The young people are so different today, you know, because people are being told, you don't have to go to church, you have to believe in that. It's very confusing. I think I was very fortunate in the time I grew up. I'm 74 now. And as a young person, I was in the sanatorium. I was in there for 3 years from the time I was 7 till, from 4 until 7. And I know I didn't have family then. I saw what was happening in the sanatorium. They called them the Indian hospitals. And I don't know why we were kept so long. There are so many things that affect us as Indigenous people. And yes, people, we do exist. My ancestors have existed for a long time, and they had beliefs all the time. They didn't wait for a non-native person to come to their place and tell them, well, you've got to believe. You know, when I go to a powwow, I see a lot of I see people who have their heads up, you know, they're not looking down anymore. They know who they are. So it's very confusing listening to all the to the way the Bible was. The Bible is a lot of violence in it. You know, I don't even know how we manage to live from day to day, because what is happening in our lives, it's already happening. It's things that happened before in a different way. You know, I'm glad that I am the way I am, and with the parents and the grandparents that I had, the community I grew up in. My community was very strong. My community was very respectful, you know, and people had their beliefs right to the end. Even now, when I hear Cree hymns being sung, uh, you know, it's a different feeling, because you know when the person is gone and they've left this earth, that we're going, and it's a beautiful land. It's a beautiful place. It's not what we're experiencing. You know, it's not what we see. We have to look for the good in everything that we see every day. Uh, you know, I don't think I would have made a very good scholar because of what I'm hearing. I believe in the goodness of life. I believe in the simple things in life, and I look for respect. You know, in respecting that's around us. And I wasn't going to get into this conversation, but listening to Vincent, I know where he's coming from. I know it's almost like we're the forgotten people, and we're not. We're very much in existence. How do you think we survived all these years? Because Kisemantu gave us the heart of what we believe in. Kisemantu was beside us, and he still is. You know, I don't know. I'm glad I came into this conversation, but it's very confusing listening to the history of it. I think what people should go is for the good parts of what makes us human, if that's the right word. No matter who we are, I don't think it should be color that should be considered. think it's who you are. My family is very mixed. My family has both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And when we get together, we don't see our colors. We see us as people, and that's the way life should be. I can talk for a long time, but leave it as that.
Can I ask a question of Sylvia? I'm listening to what you're saying about the respect for the land and the fact that we don't, we can worship the Creator anywhere. We don't have to be in a special building for that. I think maybe that's something that the rest of us learned during the pandemic, that you can worship in a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be in a fancy church with fancy music. What I want to know is, how would it work, or how can those of us that are settler people, how can we learn more of your way of doing, your way of believing, and your way of understanding the land? Like, is that even possible for us? I mean, we don't have the long history that you have with the land. And I'm just wondering, like, is there a way that we can learn how to do that?
As long as you believe in the Creator, and you know that He is anywhere that you are, He can direct you. Like when I go and speak somewhere, I've been invited to churches, and I used to partner with Phyllis Keeper. What I do was pray while I was standing at the front of the church, or whatever I was. The most of the time, it was right in the building. I used to say a silent prayer that the words that I was going to share were going to be given. And when I started talking, the words just come out. I don't have to think of what I'm going to say. It's already there. We can find Creator in each other. It doesn't matter who you are, as long as you're living. But we are living. We are. When I hear like we're not existing, that really bothers me, because we were here for a long time, and Gethsemane knows that we're here because we are His people too. I don't know, maybe Vincent or Murray can answer that more.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
What she was asking about.
How can settlers, find their way, as we have lived off the land for so many years? How do they find their way forward?
I think also it has to do with the phrase, all my relations.
Yes.
It isn't just people. It's everything that lives. It's the rock, it's the water, it's everything. They're all our relations. And I don't want to just say European settlers just don't have that concept. And that's what we have to learn.
Yeah, and I think part of that as well is I think a lot of non-Indigenous people have lost the whole idea of that we all come from the land and that we all belong to the land, right? And that we are all here and that we all exist within this, what we would call in Cree, this aski. Which means everything within the biosphere of where we're standing. And I think, and that we are only but a part of all of that. And I think that once we get back to that, that the whole idea of land and ownership and that kind of thing, I think will change at some point, right? And if certainly if it doesn't change, then perhaps we need to learn more. We need to experience more. But I want to say this to Sylvia. Sylvia, I think you may have misunderstood me. I certainly didn't say that that we do not exist. Neither did I want to say that that God had forgotten us or had forsaken us or something like that. But I think the point was that that the churches and the people who brought the gospel here to North America certainly thought that we were less than what they were. And I think that because of that, they used that idea for them to say that Native people do not they don't use the land properly, and this land is excuse me, this land is empty, therefore there is no one here, right? And that's all basically that I was saying. I wasn't saying that Indigenous people do not exist at all. But I also think that this is a good conversation to have, in that we need to learn from our past. And that's what our elders keep telling us. You keep telling us that as well. But I also think that non-Indigenous people need to learn that, you know, if we need to move forward, then we need to learn the past as well, which includes the church and what the church has brought.
I think that's excellent, because I think we really are a people of story. As First Nations, before colonization, we handed our understandings down for generations, and those stories shaped us and helped us with our values. And we have things like the medicine wheel as an understanding as to who we are and how we live life, and we the teachings of our ancestors lost to us by colonization and residential schools has unfortunately left us to a place where we live today with racism. You don't have to go very far. It's right within our own system. The churches have systemic racism is built right into our churches, and the idea of terra nullius, empty lands, meaning that the people that on it we were there, but we were seen as kind of savages, I think was the word was brought forward even by Ryan's sort of earlier information. The whole history of our colonization in Canada has a unique look at this, whereby people in Canada, the Indigenous peoples in Canada, created treaties, and our understanding of treaties was we are all related. We are all of us. We're relatives, and so we see you as people who come with a gift to offer, and we exchange those gifts. And we treat each other as equals and partners on this land that we share. We don't own the land, but the colonizers came in thinking that this is a resource that we now, this understanding brings us to the fact that we own this resource. So the treaties eventually led to the Indian Act and people going on to reserves. It went off in a direction that was not ever meant or understood by First Peoples, who saw this as an equal relationship. As long as the waters shall flow, as long as the rivers shall flow, the sun shall shine, the grass shall grow, we will be in this relationship together. So if you want to look to the way forward as settlers, it's coming back, it's to what those treaties meant, and so that we can walk in partnership together, and that we learn from one another and we grow together, and to understand that those who lived off the land for centuries know something about living on this land in a different way, in a way that sees, actually the first peoples, I think, were more egalitarian than what we see in our society today, which is more individualistic. Me, myself, and I seems to be an attitude of our society, but in an egalitarian way of looking at it. You are responsible for your brothers, your sisters, and you live in community with them, in relationship with them, and you look after them. And it's interesting because in our little subcommittee, we were looking for a book to study, and we found one with David Robertson, one of a great Indigenous author from Norway House, where Vincent is from. And he says, well, we kind of know, the people of Norway House have this kinship, and they do. And the thing is that it's a kinship, I think, that Indigenous peoples have when they see each other as brothers and sisters. We are all relatives together. It's a different attitude than me, myself, and I, and that we don't care for one another. We don't look after one another. We don't treat each other with respect and dignity, and give that dignity to them. And it comes from our understanding of Creator. But on the national scene with the Indigenous picture in the Anglican Church, we are creating a constitution that says exactly that where two people come together, the church is there. You don't need a cathedral or a building of rocks or stone. Two people are the church. And so I think that's the way forward.
Can I just want to answer, there's something, I just loved hearing from you, Sylvia, and I just thought it was wonderful to hear your voice, and I've learned a lot from you over the years, Sylvia. I also wanted just to say, in response to what Karen had asked, I just share quickly my story was that when I came to Australia in 1992 and then got involved in community work here and reconciliation with the reconciliation movement in Australia. When I went back in 1999, and we had the Pan American Games in Winnipeg, actually, but we had the gathering of the grandmothers before that at the Robert A. Steen Community Center. And I had met briefly Jesse Howell. Oh my goodness, the man is coming here to mow my lawn. Anyway, I shall continue. He will go. Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, it ended up that at the gathering, that there was a gathering of the women of the Americas, and May Louise Campbell and Jessie Howell and these grandmothers that I had first just met a week ago were there, and I went to the I went up to them and I just was chatting and stuff like this, and then Jessie Howell in particular, who has become a wonderful friend of mine, she said, how are you? You've come from Australia and things like this. And I said, yes, but I said, now I'm very confused. I don't know where I'm at or where's home or how do I don't understand. There's so much I need to learn. And, the very first thing she said to me was, you need to come to my moon circles. You need to come and stand on the land, And, honestly, that was so transformative for me. It was just so transformative because I was gently then guided and, was taken under the wing, you might sort of say. And so I'm still on a learning journey, but I will say that that was a huge transformation for me because, again, as an my parents were Irish Catholic. I was raised Catholic. I never had the faith. I still don't have faith in that way. But I just feel very centered and very peaceful and very committed. And certainly I've learned that in Australia as well, about the importance of the land and the teachings of the land and of everyday life. So I just want to say that as a non-Indigenous person, that was part of my transformation. And it makes me very peaceful when I follow the moons and when I follow the moon circles and the grandmothers. And also, I will just mention as well that over time now, 30 something or 40 years later, I have relatives Inuit. My nephew is married and living in the Arctic, and my grandchildren are Métis as well through my son's wife. And so everything that I was learning before, now it all coalesces for me as a Canadian, but obviously as an Australian as well. So I just share that quick story that as a non-Indigenous person, it was extremely valuable for me to have somebody that said to me, why don't you just come and be on the land, right? And then learn from that. So that's what helped me. Sorry, I had to say that. And sorry for the disruption.
Well, thanks everybody for all your contributions, and thank you especially to Sylvia. Very valuable. I think we've been on this Zoom call now for about 2 hours, and I know that Zoom is not the most enjoyable medium. So if I think we can bring the formal time to a close. If anybody wants to stick around and has any last
sharing the screen a
comments.
bit. I'm just sharing something.
Okay.
There we are.
If anybody, I can stay around for about another 5 minutes, but I think people are free to leave now if they would like.
Yeah. Just that, just take a note of this.
And Elizabeth, you might want to say something about events that are coming up.
Oh yeah, we have some more events coming and there's still time to register. On Friday, you can learn about the 7 teachings with Amanda and paint a picture of an eagle feather. And next Monday, she's doing dream catchers and we have kits made up already for people. You can register for that and then I'll get the kits to you somehow. And then the Monday after that, we're actually going to be talking about the video about the doctrine of discovery. That's the July 5th. And then on the 6th, we're actually doing a mapping exercise, a virtual mapping exercise where you could do the PWRDF's mapping the ground we stand on, and we do it by Zoom now. And it's really interesting, and it really sort of brings, it's like a myth buster about empty land. Okay, I'll stop sharing now. I just think that what this was really turned out into a very good discussion tonight.
I really
Thank you.
I thank Sylvia for what she's doing, and it just brought back to how many times I used to go and talk to elders from about the age of 4 years old till the time I was in my 30s. Always made a point of seeing each one of the elders on a regular basis. And I would bring something to them and they would always give something back to me. And I never realized how important it was until now. You know, or just recently, more than just now. But I mean, it's something that I grew up with and I treasure every moment of every one of those people.
And it was so nice to hear Sylvia's voice again, because she would be our elder at the blanket exercises and part of our meetings. And I've missed that soft, gentle voice she has, and her laugh. The laugh is good too.
That's nice to know.
I talk to her quite often.
Oh, good.
Not as often as I would like to, but
It's a different ballgame.
No kidding.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you very much. It was excellent. Thank you. Very much appreciated. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye for now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Your meeting.
Okay, it looks like just, yeah.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks for coming. All right, I think
Bye.
I'll take off. So take care.
Yes, you probably have work to do. Okay, I'll end the meeting for everybody. Ryan, go and have a beer.
Thanks. See you.
Okay, bye all. You're from, where are you from?
I'm from what we call Jayawa and Guyable country and Yagara as well. So of course, we don't have any treaty arrangements here in Australia, but we do recognize traditional owners and the areas that we come from, or that we are,
That's-
you know, existing in. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's very important.
Yes,
Well,
absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, one more minute and should we get going then?
I think
Yeah,
so.
I think you're right. Oh, I guess we have to let your brother in.